Brian stood at the subway platform, clutching his leather portfolio, nervously glancing at the clock above the station entrance. The train was late again, a seemingly small inconvenience, yet it held the weight of 1,000 bricks on his shoulders. Today marked his first day at a prestigious tech firm, and the subway's delay threatened to tarnish it. By the time the train screeched into the station and carried him to his destination, Brian was 15 minutes behind schedule. He sprinted through the glass doors of the sleek corporate office, gasping for air as he approached the front desk to check in. His suit, carefully chosen for its professional appeal, clung uncomfortably from the rush. As Brian hurried into the conference room for the onboarding meeting, all eyes turned toward him. A tall woman with sharp features and a tailored blazer stood at the head of the table. Caroline Stone, his new boss, was known for her perfectionism and unyielding discipline. "You're late," she said icily, her gaze piercing through him. Brian opened his mouth to explain the subway delay, but Caroline cut him off. "This is a place for professionals. If you can't manage your time, perhaps you should reconsider working here." The other employees exchanged glances, their silence speaking volumes. Humiliated, Brian sank into his seat, determined to prove his worth. The rest of the day passed in a blur of introductions and orientations, but Caroline's words echoed in his mind. By the time Brian returned home, exhaustion had settled into his bones. He replayed the moment in his head, vowing to ensure that Caroline would never find another reason to criticize him. Despite the rocky start, Brian felt a flicker of hope. He believed he could succeed even under the sharp gaze of a boss who seemed determined to see him fail. In the weeks that followed, Brian became a diligent worker. He stayed late, perfected every task, and avoided even the smallest misstep. Yet, his efforts seemed invisible to Caroline, who scrutinized his every move. During a team meeting, Brian presented an innovative idea to streamline a critical project. The room was abuzz with interest, but before he could elaborate, Caroline dismissed it as unrealistic. The rejection stung, but Brian held his head high. He couldn't afford to let her see his disappointment. Caroline's behavior baffled the team. While she encouraged innovation from others, she seemed to reserve her harshest critiques for Brian. Some colleagues began to quietly sympathize with him, whispering encouragement when Caroline wasn't around. Brian appreciated their kindness but refused to lean on their pity. He wanted to earn their respect through his work, not their sympathy. A month into his role, Brian thought he had found his rhythm. But during a team presentation, Caroline's critique reached new heights. "This work is sloppy," she announced, her voice dripping with disdain. "I expect better, even from someone who's inexperienced." Her words, spoken before the entire team, felt like a punch to the gut. As Brian stood there, the humiliation etched across his face, Caroline turned to him with a smirk. "Irresponsible trash," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for him and the room to hear. That night, Brian couldn't sleep. Caroline's words replayed in his mind like a broken record. He stared at his ceiling, questioning whether he belonged at the firm. But amidst the self-doubt, a spark of determination ignited. Brian resolved to prove her wrong, not out of spite, but to show her that her perception of him was utterly misguided. Brian threw himself into his work like never before. While others clocked out at 6 p.m., he stayed until the building's lights dimmed. He studied every detail, ensuring his reports were flawless and his analyses bulletproof. His peers began to notice the quiet transformation. "Brian's a machine," one whispered during a lunch break. But for every step forward Brian took, Caroline seemed to pull him 2 steps back. When a major client praised the team's work, Caroline accepted the accolades without a word of acknowledgement for Brian's efforts. Though his heart sank, he masked his frustration behind a polite smile. Recognition wasn't what drove him, he needed to prove his value, even if no one else saw it. A critical project was nearing its deadline, and Brian had stayed up for 3 consecutive nights to perfect the final presentation. The morning of the big pitch arrived, and Brian handed Caroline the polished deck with quiet pride. During the meeting, the clients were visibly impressed, nodding along as Caroline presented the work. But when the meeting ended, she walked out without so much as a glance in Brian's direction. Later, he overheard her speaking with a colleague. "I had to carry that project to the finish line," she said. The betrayal stung deeply, but Brian channeled his anger into resolve. If recognition wouldn't come, then he would work until his absence would be undeniable. One rainy morning, Brian's subway line experienced another delay. By the time he reached the office, Caroline was already at her desk. "Late again?" she remarked, her tone icy. Before he could respond, she added, "You're consistent, at least." "Consistently disappointing." The words were the final crack in an already fragile foundation. As Brian sat at his desk, his resolve wavered. For the first time, he questioned whether his persistence was worth the pain. But quitting without making his mark felt like letting Caroline win. He clenched his fists, vowing that this would not be his legacy at the firm. Brian entered the office later than usual, his heart pounding from the sprint up the stairs. Caroline was already waiting by his desk, her arms crossed and her lips pressed into a thin line. "Late again?" she hissed, her voice dripping with disdain. "I guess professionalism is too much to expect from you." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, daring him to respond. This time, Brian didn't shrink under her criticism. Instead, he stood straighter, his jaw tightening. "I've given everything to this job," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I've stayed late, worked weekends, and tried to meet every expectation, even the impossible ones. But no matter what I do, it's never enough for you." He placed his employee badge and resignation letter on the desk. "This is where I draw the line. I'm worth more than this." Caroline blinked, caught off guard by his composure. "You're making a mistake," she said, trying to regain control. Brian shook his head. "The only mistake I made was letting you treat me like this for so long." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Caroline staring at his back, a flicker of doubt creeping into her otherwise steely expression. Brian's colleagues gathered around his desk as he packed his belongings. They expressed their regret over his departure, offering words of encouragement. "You didn't deserve that," one said quietly, glancing toward Caroline's office. "You'll do great somewhere else, Brian," another added. Their words were kind, but Brian couldn't shake the sting of leaving under such circumstances. Caroline watched from her office window as Brian exited the building. Her smirk had faded, replaced by a faint unease she couldn't quite place. She told herself it was relief, the team would be better off without him. But deep down, a small voice whispered that she might have made a mistake. With Brian gone, the team faced immediate challenges. A high-profile project Brian had been managing fell into disarray. Caroline assigned the tasks to other employees, but none of them had the deep understanding Brian had developed. As deadlines loomed, the team began to feel the weight of his absence. Caroline, however, refused to acknowledge the growing chaos. She brushed off concerns with curt remarks and focused on maintaining her authority. But late at night, as she reviewed the project files, she couldn't ignore the detailed plans Brian had left behind. Each note and calculation was a testament to his dedication, a dedication she had never fully recognized. As the project spiraled further out of control, Caroline found herself working late nights to pick up the slack. Her frustration grew, not just with her team but with herself. She recalled Brian's final words, "You'll regret this," and wondered if he had been right. The project, once a shining opportunity for the company, was now a glaring problem. One evening, as she sifted through Brian's meticulously organized files, Caroline paused. She found notes on potential risks and backup strategies, details no one else had considered. Her chest tightened as she realized just how much she had underestimated him. The project's failure became a topic of discussion in executive meetings, with upper management questioning Caroline's leadership. While she defended her team, the doubts in her mind began to grow. She replayed her interactions with Brian, the way she dismissed him despite his dedication. One of her colleagues mentioned seeing an article about a rising entrepreneur named Brian, hinting that he might be the same person who had worked under her. Caroline brushed off the comment but couldn't shake her curiosity. Later that night, she searched for his name online and found an article praising his new tech venture. Her heart sank as she realized the magnitude of what she had lost. Caroline's suspicions were confirmed when she saw a feature about Brian's startup in an industry newsletter. The article detailed his innovative approach and the rapid growth of his company. Her stomach churned as she read the accolades, each word a reminder of her misjudgment. Her team, too, began to take notice of Brian's success. "Didn't he used to work here?" one colleague asked during a lunch break. Caroline overheard the conversation and felt a pang of regret. She had always prided herself on identifying talent, yet she had driven one of her most promising employees away. The company faced mounting pressure as clients began questioning their ability to deliver. Caroline struggled to maintain her composure, but the weight of her decisions bore down on her. During a meeting with executives, she was directly asked about the fallout from the failed project. Her usual confidence faltered as she gave a carefully rehearsed explanation, leaving the room with a growing sense of inadequacy. That evening, she received an invitation to an industry conference. The keynote speaker was listed as Brian Williams, CEO of a successful tech startup. Caroline hesitated before accepting the invitation, unsure if she could face the man she had wronged. The auditorium was packed, a palpable buzz of anticipation filling the air. When Brian Williams walked onto the stage, the applause was thunderous. His presence was magnetic, his confidence radiating with each step. He began his speech with a calm, steady voice, sharing his journey from obscurity to becoming the CEO of a groundbreaking tech company. "There was a time," Brian said, pausing to meet the eyes of the audience, "when I felt invisible. My ideas were dismissed, my efforts ignored. But that experience taught me something invaluable. Your worth isn't defined by how others see you. It's defined by how you see yourself and the work you're willing to put in to prove it." The room was silent, his words resonating deeply with everyone present. As he concluded, Brian delivered a powerful closing statement. "Respect is not a privilege, it's a foundation. Without it, no company, no leader, and no person can truly thrive. I stand here today because I refuse to let disrespect define my story." The audience erupted into applause, and among them, Caroline felt an ache in her chest. His words were like a mirror, reflecting the flaws she had long ignored in herself. Brian's presentation captivated the audience, weaving stories of personal challenges and professional triumphs. He spoke candidly about facing doubt and criticism, though he never named names. "Sometimes," he said, looking directly into the audience, "the obstacles we face are people who can't see our potential. But those obstacles teach us the most important lessons." Caroline felt a flush of heat creep up her neck. She couldn't escape the feeling that his words were meant for her. As the applause thundered through the room, Caroline sat motionless. She watched as Brian stepped down from the stage and was immediately surrounded by admirers. Though she considered approaching him, fear held her back. How could she face the man she had so cruelly underestimated? Caroline left the conference in a daze, Brian's words replaying in her mind. The weight of her mistakes was undeniable. For years, she had dismissed her treatment of Brian as justified, but seeing him now, respected, admired, and thriving, forced her to confront the harsh truth. She had failed him as a leader and as a person. At the office the next day, Caroline couldn't focus. Her team noticed her unusual quietness, but no one dared to ask. She immersed herself in work, hoping to drown out her thoughts. Yet, every time she glanced at a report or draft, she thought of Brian's meticulous notes and how she had ignored his contributions. 2 weeks later, Caroline attended another industry event, hoping to network and rebuild her company's reputation. To her surprise, Brian was there, chatting with a group of executives. Summoning her courage, Caroline approached him. "Brian," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. He turned, his expression neutral but polite. "Caroline," he replied, extending a hand. They exchanged pleasantries, but the conversation was laced with unspoken tension. Caroline struggled to find the right words, finally blurting out, "I want to apologize." Brian tilted his head, his demeanor calm. "For what?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. Caroline hesitated before answering. "For not seeing your worth when you worked under me," she admitted. "I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Brian's response was measured. "I appreciate your words," he said, "but I've moved on." His calmness was more cutting than anger could have been. Caroline felt the sting of his indifference, but she understood. She had spent so long tearing him down that she couldn't expect forgiveness overnight. As the conversation ended, Caroline watched Brian walk away, surrounded by people who valued him. She returned to her hotel room that night, grappling with the realization that she had squandered an opportunity to nurture extraordinary talent. Caroline decided to pen a letter to Brian, pouring her thoughts onto the page. She wrote about the lessons she had learned since his departure and the impact his keynote had on her. Though she knew he might never respond, writing the letter felt like a small step toward redemption. She sent it with no expectations, simply hoping he would read it. Weeks passed with no reply, but Caroline felt a weight lifted. She channeled her regret into action, vowing to become the kind of leader who inspired rather than crushed. Months later, Brian responded with a brief email. "Caroline," it read, "I accept your apology. Growth is a journey for all of us. Best of luck on yours." The words were simple yet profound. Caroline realized that while forgiveness might not lead to reconciliation, it could still be a powerful tool for healing. Buoyed by Brian's response, Caroline began to implement changes in her leadership style. She encouraged open dialogue, celebrated her team's successes, and prioritized mentorship. Slowly, the atmosphere in the office began to shift. The changes in Caroline's leadership style were subtle at first. She began acknowledging her team's efforts in meetings, giving credit where it was due. When an intern presented an idea during a brainstorming session, Caroline surprised everyone by praising it and encouraging further development. "Great work," she said, her voice carrying genuine warmth. The room was silent for a moment, the team unsure how to react. Then, one by one, they began to nod and smile, sensing that something in Caroline had shifted. As weeks turned into months, the office atmosphere began to improve. Projects flowed more smoothly, and team members started to collaborate more openly. Caroline's acknowledgement of her shortcomings, though never explicitly stated, was evident in her actions. While she couldn't erase her mistakes with Brian, she could ensure they weren't repeated. Caroline initiated one-on-one meetings with her team members, something she had avoided in the past. These sessions gave employees a chance to share their thoughts and concerns. Many were hesitant at first, unsure if this new Caroline was genuine. But over time, her consistent efforts began to break down their walls. In one meeting, a junior analyst hesitated before speaking. "I used to think you didn't care about us," she admitted. "But lately, it feels different." Caroline nodded, her throat tight. "I care deeply," she replied. "I just didn't know how to show it before." The analyst smiled, and for the first time, Caroline felt the beginning of redemption, not from words but from actions that spoke louder. Despite her growth, challenges continued to arise. A major project hit an unexpected snag when a client demanded a complete redesign just weeks before the launch. The team panicked, unsure if they could meet the new deadline. In the past, Caroline would have reacted with frustration, placing blame on whoever was nearest. But this time, she gathered her team and addressed them calmly. "We're in this together," she said. "I'll stay late every night if that's what it takes, but we're going to deliver something extraordinary." Her words galvanized the team. They rallied, working long hours but with a renewed sense of purpose. When the project was delivered on time and exceeded the client's expectations, Caroline made sure every team member received recognition. The success of the redesigned project brought Caroline's team into the spotlight. Upper management praised their efforts during a company-wide meeting, with Caroline insisting that her team members take center stage. As the applause echoed through the room, Caroline felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not from personal accolades but from seeing her team thrive. For the first time, Caroline began to understand the true meaning of leadership. It wasn't about exerting control or proving herself, it was about empowering others and creating an environment where everyone could succeed. The charity gala was in full swing, the room alive with the hum of conversation and the clink of glasses. Caroline spotted Brian across the room, surrounded by industry leaders who hung on his every word. Summoning her courage, she approached him, her steps measured but determined. "Brian," she said softly, her voice almost lost in the chatter around them. He turned, his expression polite but distant. "Caroline," he acknowledged, shaking her hand. For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of unspoken words between them. "You've done well for yourself," Caroline said, her tone tinged with a mix of pride and regret. Brian smiled faintly. "Thank you," he replied. "It's been a journey." Caroline hesitated, then spoke with a vulnerability she rarely showed. "I want you to know that I've learned from my mistakes, especially the ones I made with you. I'm sorry for how I treated you." Brian studied her for a moment, then nodded. "It takes courage to admit that," he said. "I hope it helps you grow." Though his words were measured, they carried no malice, only a quiet resolution to leave the past behind. As he walked away, Caroline felt both relief and the weight of knowing that some wounds leave permanent scars, no matter how much healing occurs. Inspired by her encounter with Brian, Caroline decided to take on a mentorship role within the company. She began guiding a promising junior employee, offering the support and encouragement she wished she had given Brian. The employee flourished under her guidance, earning accolades and eventually a promotion. Caroline watched with pride as her mentee grew into a confident leader. It felt like a small step toward redemption, a way to give back for the opportunities she had squandered. Meanwhile, Brian's startup continued to thrive, earning national recognition for its innovative approach. In interviews, he often spoke about the challenges he faced early in his career and how they shaped his leadership philosophy. "Every setback is an opportunity to grow," he would say. Though he never mentioned Caroline by name, it was clear she had played a pivotal role in his journey. Caroline's reformed leadership began to ripple beyond her team. The company's culture shifted, with other managers adopting her more empathetic approach. Employee satisfaction surveys improved, and the firm's reputation as a great place to work grew. Caroline felt a deep sense of fulfillment knowing that her transformation was making a tangible impact. Years later, Caroline wrote a second letter to Brian. This time, it wasn't an apology but a thank you. She expressed her gratitude for the lessons she had learned from their time together and how they had shaped her into a better leader. She never expected a response, but writing the letter felt like closing a chapter in her life. Sitting in her office one evening, Caroline reflected on her journey. She thought about Brian's parting words, "Respect costs nothing but means everything." They had stayed with her, guiding her through the most challenging moments of her transformation. Though she couldn't change the past, she had learned to build a better future. As she turned off the lights and headed home, Caroline felt at peace, knowing she had finally become the leader she was meant to be.